So my plan A was to use the decals to put the waterline and the boot topping down. It's quite a complicated arrangement, as you can see here. Now I don't know, but as I've said before, I suspect the previous owner of this kit did not look after it particularly well or store it particularly well, and I found the decals have broken up on me whilst trying to float them off. They seem to be stuck onto the decal sheet. So that's an issue which is affecting my ability to get it to look to the standard I want by patching it together. We haven't finished there. You can see we've got some movement to do, but you can see here how many times it's broken on me, several, and we've had to patch it together. The problem if you don't use the decals is that you lose the depth markers. There is an alternative waterline that can be used, but you do lose the depth markers. So what I'm going to try and do is lift the decals off so that we can clean up the mess that... Now at this point, Naval in Germany became aware of my plight and very kindly offered to replace the decals, which they've done, and within 2 to 3 days I had a complete sheet of fresh decals so that I can keep my build and my video on track. So a very, very big heartfelt thank you to Naval Germany for that amazing piece of help. Come charging in like the cavalry, and as you can see we now have decals on, and it really comes to life once those decals are in place. So we can progress with our build thanks to Naval.
We're now at the point where we need to start applying the decals, and the first decal that makes sense to put on is the stern decal that actually goes underneath and then starts the boot line and waterline. The issue with the decals supplied in the kit is that they're incorrect. You can see here there's a little dog leg, and that is designed to run along the side of the hull and then cut along this curve, and then that straight edge goes along here. The problem is your boot line actually should go underneath here, and what we should be doing is actually following this line that I've pencil marked. So from about this point here to about this point here, we actually go underneath this flat area, the waterline, because this bit sort of sits just slightly above the surface of the water in still water. So if you look at this photo, you can see how it's cutting underneath. Now obviously the boot line needs to go on there, and the water line. So I'm going to cut this decal about this point here so that we can align that and deal with the hole that we need to make, and then we can align that separately. So as long as we do a nice clean straight cut, that shouldn't be difficult to sort out. So we cut the decal in half in a straight line. It's important that you do that with scissors, not a knife, because a knife will not give you the sharpest edge. That means this now becomes a lot easier to handle. So while the decal is soaking, we're just going to clean the area using an anti-static brush and get any dust and debris off so this sits nice and flat. cleaning the area and around the area. It's amazing how this stuff travels. So I'm happy that we're good. Okay, our first decal is ready to slide off. And what we're going to do is we're going to line that edge up with the corner, the little dog leg. So we've got the decal in position, and I'm just carefully flattening that out. And the line I'm most interested in is the boot line waterline. Everything else I can adjust. Okay, so our next job is to just soften that decal up a little bit. So we're going to use some microset in the first instance. That should make the area over the engine pod hole just stand out a little bit as the decal sinks down into it. So our next decal should lead straight off from here along our line, and as long as we get the cut edge square, it should be in the correct place. So we'll get that into soak and give this next area a clean.
So we're in the process of working through the decals, and there's lots and lots that go on this lower hull. And what I've noticed is, if you have the older set of decals, which is that one there, then the instructions are correct. The numbers being called out are absolutely correct, and what's depicted in that top corner is the old decal sheet. Now, because I've got a new decal sheet as well, and that's the decal sheet that I'm actually using, I've realised that the layout is different, and they've actually got some of the numbers incorrect. So when you're going through this list of numbers here along the bottom, you can see there's lots of them. Then some of them you need to be looking for the actual decal shape and checking against the image rather than using the number. So the 56s, for example, are all okay, but the 66 that's referenced there is a 64 on the new decal sheet. And there's not just one mix-up, there's several. So go through it very, very carefully and find the decal that works for the side of the hull that you're working on.
Okay, so we've drawn around the kit part to give me a template for the one we're going to scratch build. And that's just going to allow us to avoid having to fill all of these ejector pin marks and filling the holes where the staircases go. So it's basically just going to save me quite a bit of time. So we're going to remove it roughly in the first instance. So I'm just going to score around the outside of where we've penciled. I'm not trying to do it exactly because I know that I won't. So it's easier to just go around the outside and then we can trim and sand back to the pencil line. There we have it. Okay, so next thing we need to do is just tidy up these edges and get it down to that penciled line. So I'm just going to trim down so we've got less sanding to do. Okay. Right, we can sand that now. Okay, I'll get this sorted and come back to you when it's done. Right, so we have put the part out and we've sanded it so that we've got basically a replacement for this deck. So what I want to do now is just for orientation while we mark out where we're going to build our additional bulkheads and what have you. I just want to mark out a couple of things. Firstly, we've marked out the positions of the windows, so I just want to copy them onto the new deck. And the one thing about this plastic card is it's actually easier to draw on than the original kit part because it's less glossy. Okay, and then if we push it right on top so that it's perfectly level, I'm also going to mark out these little holes because that is basically the position of my stairs coming down through from this kit part. Right, the next thing I want to put in is the pool, which gives me some orientation. So this goes right underneath the pool. I know it's slightly oversized, so what we're going to do is use these inside dimensions rather than the outside dimensions, so that I can be a little bit more accurate with my measurements. So we need to measure the depth. Well, this raised rim is, let's see if we can do it with a micrometer. Right, so this ridge is 1.2 millimeters. So we need to add that onto. So if we say 16.5, that'll do us. So let's work out our halfway point and put a halfway line in. So we're exactly 95. So my halfway point is there. There's my halfway line, and we want to be 16.5 millimeters in from the outside edge. Okay, so that should be the start point of my pool on the inside. So let's just measure 15.8. So we'll call it 16 for ease. So we want 8 millimeters either side of that line. sure that is square. Yeah, okay, so that's the start of my pool. So I'm just going to mark out the rest of the pool and then I'll come back to you. So I've marked out the position of the pool. You can see I've marked out where the steps land, and then we've just put where the solid bulkheads are, so that we know where these openings are, which are the main feature if you're stood on this deck. And then you can see where the openings stop, and we're in the side hull of the ship there. So that orientates me for the scratch building that we've got to do. Now the next thing we've got to look at is a room that comes next onto here, which we don't need to do anything with the room other than show an outside edge. So what we need to do now is to mark out the bulkheads as they can be seen through the openings. The other thing that we want to do is add an exhaust that's not actually included in the kit, and we know that the exhaust comes through against the edge of the opening here and here, so second opening in on each side from the center point of the stern. So we've got to put the bulkhead in. There is some form of bulkhead that comes out here around a room of some type, and there's various doors that we need to add on. Now, the reason why we marked out the pool is because the room or rooms that come out here are the same width as the pool. So what we can do is draw an initial line. So that gets me my width as we stick out, and then we've got to work out how much of the deck area is free. So from this outside edge, we're at roughly 5mm, but we've got to take into account the fact that there is some kit area as well. So when we glue this into the model, there is a lip that goes all the way around that this sits into, which is 1mm deep. So we need to take account for that in our calculations. So I know that the bulkhead should be roughly 5mm back from the bulkhead of the ship. So that's going to be 4mm on here, so we can account for the millimetre of the model part. So if I go on my centre line, so that gives me a bulkhead point. So it's really quite close up, so very visible through the openings. So, and we know that the width is the same as the pool, and we put those lines in. So now there is also a door on here, which is pretty much almost against this centre line. So we now need to make a calculation of door widths, which will be the same we use all the way through. There's a number of doors. So when we look at this part, there are a couple of very poorly depicted doors, and at their widest part at the bottom, they're sort of pyramid shaped to allow them to come out of the moulding tool easily. When we look at the widest part, they're 2 planks wide, so they're 2mm wide, and I think that's still a little bit narrow. So from looking at my reference material, I reckon the doors should be about 2.5mm wide. So that's what we're going to work on for this area here. So we need a 2.5mm door, which starts just slightly off centre from the centre line. So we're going to start it 3mm over.
Let's take a few moments to consider the mooring decks on Queen Mary 2. Now, for efficient mooring alongside a quay or a terminal or a pier, the ropes from the bollards on the pier to the ship need to be as horizontal as possible. The more of an angle you have, the more inefficient the ropes are at holding the ship fast. And with the great height of Queen Mary 2, when you think that the bow of the ship is some 21 metres above the waterline, to have had the mooring stations right at the top on the forecastle would have meant that the ropes would have had a very steep angle down to most quaysides. So we elected to have the mooring decks in the middle of the ship, in the hull, and they're actually around deck 3 level. So the forward and aft mooring decks are around 9.5 to 12 metres above the waterline. The anchor handling deck is actually one deck higher on Queen Mary 2, on deck 4 rather than deck 3, and that's to allow us to place the anchor pockets a little bit higher above the waterline, so that if the ship is pitching badly, there's far less chance of water coming up the hawse pipe and flooding the forward mooring deck. Although invariably water does get up there, but having it at that height means it's far less susceptible to such water ingress. So that's why we have the mooring decks low down in the hull of the ship. And at the stern, as Jason will discuss with the model of Queen Mary 2, there are some very large rubbing strakes, vertical, he called them staples, embedded in the stern of the ship. And that's to allow the ropes from the aft mooring deck to pass around and not damage the paint. And this was especially important at New York, where the ship was actually longer than the quay that she was going to berth, and so the ropes had to go around the stern and actually go forward to be tied up. And so there was always going to be some rubbing of the ropes on the stern area of the ship, and that's why we have those large vertical fenders to prevent any damage there.
So we've marked out our additional room and our door here. So the next thing to do is to work out where the bulkhead comes along this line here. And my calculation is that it is roughly a centimetre back from this wall here. So that's our point where the bulkhead needs to travel across. So the next thing is we need the length each side of there, which is 11 millimeters. So if we put the rule there, from there. So we just want to draw that in, and again, just want to make sure that we get it nice and square. So that is our
bulkhead position marked in. And there is another door to mark in, which is on this side here. So we'll continue with our 2.5mm per door rule. And there's about 1mm of clearance before the door opening. So if we get the rule lined, and we're going to go get it on a millimetre point would be helpful. We're going to go down 1mm and then 2.5mm. So that's my second door in place. Now the bulkhead has a bit of an odd shape because it's following the curve whilst being in a straight line. So it sort of comes down in a line like that and then angles again before straightening up against the steps here. So the next calculation is going to be a little bit more complicated. So we've got a number of things we need to calculate. We need to calculate the distance of the bulkhead from the internal wall of the bulkhead, and so that we've got an idea of the deck space. We need to calculate the depth of the bulkhead from this point to this point here. You can see I've put a line in to give you an idea, and we have to compensate for the fact that the shape of the stern is not 100% correct to the actual ship shape of the stern, and we don't have a technical drawing here that's going to allow us to get this spot on. And even if we did, because the the stern is slightly more pointed than the actual stern, it's not going to make much difference to our calculation anyway. So what we're trying to do is make it look aesthetically right. So I've calculated a centimetre of deck space. So that's 9mm on here because we have this millimetre rim. And if you look at this point here, you'll see that that's 9mm. So if we apply the same 9mm, and I've calculated a depth at this stage of 19mm, that should give us about the right angle. Now, we're only drawing this on so that we can always rub it out and correct it if it doesn't look right. So that's our first bulkhead in. We can emulate that on the other side in a minute. So we've got a wall coming down. We've got some work to do on this because we've got doors and we've got an exhaust to put in. Then we've got this bulkhead coming down, and then we have another bulkhead at a slightly different angle. So let's have a look at trying to calculate that, which should come down slightly further than the pool here. Now I've marked up all my bulkhead positions, I'm just going to remove anything that's not needed in terms of pencil lines so it's clearer what I'm looking at. I am going to leave this pool because it corresponds to the underside of here, just so that I don't end up fouling underside of here, just so I don't end up fouling this kit part. So we can just rub these measurements and lines out, leaving just the bulkheads so it's clear what we need to be working with. So the next thing we need to do is add the various doors. We've put 2 in, we've got some more to do.
So these are our dimensions for the scratch building of this deck area. So the red line denotes where we're adding bulkheads, and I've put the doors on. I've put this door on here because it's particular, it's the only one facing the stern bulkhead there. There isn't one on that side of the centre line. It's in that position on the port side, whereas there isn't that door on the starboard side. So what we have down here is the depth measured from this centre point for each one of these points here. Now this line here is going to be where we terminate the whole of the deck with a bulkhead, because the kit part is too deep. On this side we have the width from the centre line, so you need to double it for things like this item here that goes right away, that spans both sides, and this bulkhead here ultimately will be the width of the whole deck, so we don't really need a dimension for that. So those are all the dimensions in millimeters. You'll need to convert them if you don't use millimeters, and then we've referenced the door width, which is 2.5 millimeters. That should give you all the information that you need for building this. So if you're scratch building your deck area, just pause the video here and you'll be able to see these dimensions. So we've marked the doors off now. We have one here, one on this side here, one on each side there. They're the most important ones. We'll come back to that in a minute. Then there's one on each side here. Now the depth of this area of deck is slightly wrong, and I've estimated our bulkhead that goes right across the full width of this is about 15 millimeters from that point there. Now these doors are important because our exhaust is going to come out right next to them through that opening in the end of the hull. So we're going to use 0.5 millimeter thick card for making our bulkheads. It's an easy card to work with. It's thin enough to cut quickly, but thick enough to hold some rigidity. The other thing that we're going to be using is some L-shaped channel, some angle, plastic card angle, and what we'll do is we'll effectively cut this into little strips just to hold things straight when we're assembling. Always the first bit that you put on is the most difficult, and then but this will just allow you to make sure everything's square right from the off. So we'll start by putting in this strip across the back, which we can then build against for the rest of the construction. So we're going to start by cutting some strip, not quite the full length, but just enough to hold the thing in a nice straight line. So if we mark it about there, okay. And the thing to do is to make sure that you've got it absolutely perfectly where you want it, and then we can just dab it in with some liquid poly. Now there's a slight bow in this, so what we're going to do is get it straight at one end, and then we can move it into place at the other end. So if I hold it at the center point there, you can see how that's bending inwards, and once we get some glue on there, it'll just hold its position naturally. Obviously you have to bear in mind that once we put that bulkhead in, we're starting to change some of those diameters. So we'll actually be cutting to length against the outlines that we've drawn. So I'll just put the angle into place there. There we go. So that should hold our first bulkhead nice and square. So we're going to do all of our bulkheads 5mm tall. We can always sand a little bit off if we need to, but that should be okay with this deck sitting on top. 5mm should give us the clearance we need. So what I'm going to do is I'm next going to cut a strip that is the full length of this, and so we'll mark that out first and then we'll measure 5mm of depth. So the easiest way to mark that to length is just to lie it across the deck. And then what we'll do is, whilst we've got the ruler there, we'll just score a line with the knife like we did before. So that's our rear bulkhead cut out. So we'll just place it against the section of angle that we've glued in place. Overhangs a little bit, that's fine, we can trim that down. But you can see how much easier that is having that bit of angle there. It just holds everything where you want it. So we'll just clamp it with our tweezers just to make sure that it's stood upright, and put our first bit of glue here in the middle. And then we can work from there. And what we'll do is we will glue those into place at the end of the bulkhead so that it keeps it nice and straight. Probably worth putting one here as well, and we can do that in a slightly different way. So I'll cut a couple of different bits. So what we can do here is we can glue these into place stood up rather than lying on the deck, so that we get a nice corner bracket support. So we can glue that in there like that, and then we know that everything's going to be nice and straight. So let's do that. So again, using my tweezers just to hold it in place. Dab of glue. And that's our bracket on. And we'll use one of these longer ones at this end here. Okay, that's our first bulkhead in place. So I'll do the same on the other side. We have both of our bulkheads in now, and to make sure that we get these angles standing up correctly, and this, I want to put these bulkheads in here. So to do that, I want to make sure that they're square and aligned with the back bulkhead, which we know is square. So we're going to use some angle to do that. Now I don't want to use a full length of this. As you can see, we could use potentially quite a bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to use just enough to get us from there to there, but to make sure it's square, we're going to cut the spare off after we've glued it in place. So let's get that done. So we butt it up against the bulkhead so that we know that it's going to all be nice and square. And then just going to hold that in place, and it is perfectly in line with the pencil mark. I can see, even if you can't. There, and we've just put a dab of glue in, and whilst that glue is just travelling, we're going to cut it off here and save that section for other jobs. There we go. And we don't have to waste lots of material. Okay, let me get the other side done and I'll come back to you. So you can see we've got our two angles in place, and we're going to use our two offcuts for the bulkheads in this area. So I'm just placing them, and then once they're placed, we can glue those in. Not too much glue, we don't want to melt it all. Okay, that's our side walls in. So next job is to face off. Because this section here is quite narrow, I don't think that we need an additional support here, so we're just going to glue this into place. So I've cut a 5mm strip and then trimmed it down, but it's slightly taller than this, so we'll just have to sand that profile down once it's glued in. So you can see we're about to put this bulkhead in. We've already put the little bracket in that's going to support it, so we're just going to put that in place there. With the liquid glue and the evergreen plastic grabs quickly, it melts quickly, so you're instantly sort of rigid really, but you do have a small amount of time if you need to adjust. That's all good. So we've just got these angled walls to put in. So with this bulkhead, we've got this change in direction at this point, so I'll put a little bracket in there to support. The first thing you've got to remember is that you're going to have to put a chamfer on this bulkhead to meet that one because of the angle. It's something that if you forget to do or you miss, you'll end up with a gap here and a weak join. So the idea is that you chamfer it and keep checking so that your forward face doesn't have a gap. Try and get this right for the camera. There we go, like so. Now to make life easier, because you're going to have to put a chamfer on each part there and a chamfer on there, what we're going to do is, rather than cut two pieces, we're just going to bend this one piece, which will give us a soft bend, but it's not going to be massively noticeable, and may actually be fairly realistic. So to do that, we're going to cut a groove in the back, which is quite an easy process. So we need to just mark out the position first. So if we put our bulkhead in place using our chamfer so we know it's right, and then mark out the bend position there. So we'll measure that so we can mark it out at both ends. I've forgotten how long we did that wall. So it's 13 millimeters. Now to cut a chamfer, the little V in there, the easiest thing to do is use a file. So I have a small triangular file here, and we're going to use the top edge to put this little bend in the bulkhead for us. So we use the top edge of one of the two cutting surfaces, and you can see that's just going to try and keep it straight, which is more difficult than you think. We don't want to go all the way through. So that's about halfway through. You can see there, and then all we need to do is bend it, and then when we put this down we can glue that joint as well, which will make it a bit stronger. So as we put it on here, we've got our chamfered edge butting up against the original bulkhead. We can glue that in place, then we can use our bend to get the angle right for this one here. So what we've got to do now is cut that to length. But what we'll do is we'll cut it slightly oversized because we need to put a chamfer in, and then just sand it down, keep test fitting it till it fits. So I'm going to do that, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. Before I run away though, I'm just going to mark out our end line. So that would be the inside of our chamfer, so we need the part to be a little longer than that. So we'll cut about 1 millimeter longer. There we go. So we just need to do a little bit of sanding, and then that should fit nicely.
Now, apart from the main and sometimes auxiliary engines producing electricity on a passenger ship, for emergencies you also have batteries that provide light whilst emergency generators are being fired up if you lose the main or auxiliary engines. And you also have these emergency generators that are there to provide enough power to power up various things on the ship, such as the lights, emergency lighting, some navigation equipment, bring the elevators or lifts down to a certain level so passengers can disembark them. So various things. And most passenger ships, certainly in the past, had one emergency generator, usually on the top deck. Well, because of Queen Mary II's great size, and certainly when she was building, she was by far the largest passenger ship ever built or ever under consideration. So we decided to fit 2 emergency generators. And these are installed at the aft part of the ship, below the area where we have the children's deck on deck 6, so the emergency generators are on deck 5, and the 2 exhausts from these generators, they poke out of the openings at the aft part of the ship, which is the crew promenade area, and you can just see them poking out from those openings. And Jason and I are going to be depicting those pipes on our additions to the Revel kit, making it more accurate and adding a bit more detail to the basic kit.
So we need to add some additional details now to the bulkheads that we've put in place, namely doors and ventilators, before we add the exhaust system that also is a key feature of this area. Doors I'm cutting out of thin plastic card. You can see I've cut 8 out here, which is what we need. The height of these doors is 4.5 millimeters, and currently they're 2.5 millimeters wide, and they look slightly thick, and so I'm going to trim them down to closer to 2 millimeters wide, and then once I'm happy with that, that'll be the standard size door we use throughout the rest of the build. To make the ventilators, which is like a louvre grating, I'm cutting thin strips of masking tape using this Infinite easy cutting mat, the Type A mat, and you can see there I've cut them on the smallest setting. So these are 5 millimeters long, and what we're going to do is we're going to place these on the bulkhead and try and slightly overlap them so that we get this look of them being louvred. If it doesn't work out, just putting them back on, butting up to each other, and then putting a small wash on it should give us the same effect. But we'll try and overlap them slightly. But at point 4, it's going to be a little bit tricky. So you can see we now have the tape on the bulkhead, and I have managed to overlap. I couldn't film it because I just needed it so close to my eyes. But basic process was to put the bottom strip on and then keep putting a strip on above it, using 2 tweezers to clamp it in place as I went, and then they just slightly overlap on the top. I think that looks alright, and by the time we've painted it in, should look okay. Just need to straighten up the 2 edges. So that is it for this video. In the next episode, we'll be having a look at installing the rooms on the inside of the hull ahead of putting the promenade deck on. We'll also be looking at installing the replacement scratch built deck, the exhaust system, and the deck with the pool that goes above it. And if we've got time, we'll have a look at the scratch building required in the bow before we can put the bow deck on, which is also something we need to look at before we put the promenade deck on. So plenty coming up in the next episode. Stephen and I hope that you'll be able to join us. In the meantime, enjoy your modelling, take care, and we will see you very soon.